Thanks for joining us today. What you're about to hear is a presentation of Hickory Grove Presbyterian Church in Mount Juliet, Tennessee. To know more about the church, visit their website, hickorygrovepca.org.
I forgot to start the recorder. Okay. Everything I just said was deeply profound. Let's pray. I'm kidding. All right. So, post-woke, that's the title of the book. And it uses a somewhat controversial word, woke. What do we mean, or what do you think people mean when they use the word woke? Nobody. Kristen?
I guess I always thought they meant that they were awakened or awoke from some sleep and that had come to the realization of, I don't know, that they deserved more, or things weren't equal, or they woke up.
Yeah. So that's good. We're starting with the literal meaning, right? Waking up. All right, and then we move to the figural. What are we waking up to? John?
I feel it's being used more as a pejorative term.
Yeah.
Where it's like, oh, you're woke.
Yeah. Yeah. It can definitely be used as a pejorative, kind of like a derogatory catch-all for, people or maybe products, cultural products that are maybe imbibed pretty deeply of progressive cultural norms and values. Like, I really want to enjoy Rings of Power, but it's super woke, right? That's one way to use the word. Laurie?
The acronym WOKE, I wrote one time, is willfully overlooking known evil.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Yeah.
I think it sort of means looking at all of society in terms of oppressor-oppressed.
Yes.
And who the oppressors are, which are the traditionally powerful and the oppressed, marginalized or minority type groups.
Yeah. Yeah, and you pretty much hit the nail on the head in terms of what people mean by woke when they're speaking from within the critical theory or the critical tradition. When they're using woke as a kind of technical term, an adjective, a positive thing. And what you just said is essentially what we're going to be focusing on tonight as we talk about this. Evan, did I see your hand?
No, that's fine.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, there's, you got the derogatory sort of catch-all term. You got woke being used as, a cultural mood, right? The woke powers at Netflix have cast Aslan as a woman, right? That's one way we use the word woke. It also has a positive evaluation of, or a kind of critical awareness, kind of getting at some of what Tom was talking about. Some years ago, a pastor by the name of Eric Mason wrote a book called Woke Church. And back then, that title basically meant a church that is sensitive to maybe racial difference, racial disparity, some of the unique aspects of Black experience, Black church, things like that. But over the past several years, woke has come to mean something more technical than that, something that, from my perspective, I might say is much more pernicious than that. And it takes its cues from critical theory. So as we dive into this topic, we're going to set aside the adjective woke, not because it's useless, but because it's loaded, and it's not always easy to understand exactly what people mean by it. And we are going to consider the ideology that undergirds it, which is critical theory. So what is critical theory? In a nutshell, critical theory is an approach to social reality that views all things through the lens of human power dynamics. And it divides human beings up into two main categories, the oppressor and the oppressed. And it analyzes and evaluates that dynamic of oppression from a number of different angles. Angles like race, gender, sexual orientation, age, physical ability. So our goal together tonight is to understand what critical theory is and to evaluate its core ideas through a biblical lens. Also, we want to consider, as we do this, how its desire for the liberation of the oppressed can ultimately only be fulfilled through the gospel. So to give a brief history of where critical theory comes from, starts at least with Karl Marx. We can go back to Hegel, but we don't need to do that. And Karl Marx, you know the name Karl Marx from the Communist Manifesto. And for Karl Marx, his major concern was economic inequality. And sort of his grand theory of history was the history succeeds via epochs in which people in power control the means of production, right? And the people in power who control the means of production enforce their power or maintain their power by enforcing cultural norms and values and ideology. Capitalism. Capitalism is the latest stage in this historical process. And it is the most efficient means that the world has found of keeping the oppressed, who Karl Marx would call the proletariat, under the thumb of the oppressor, who he would call the bourgeoisie. Now, Marx predicted that this history would continue and would ultimately culminate in revolution. That the working class would rise up, they would revolt, they would seize the means of production, and that would lead the world into something of a communist utopia. Has that idea been tried? Multiple times. Can anyone name any of the times in which it was tried?
Cuba,
the Russian Revolution. Anything else? Cambodia, Khmer Rouge, yeah. Korea, China, right? So the details vary in each case, right? But the basic pattern is essentially the same. The working class revolts, empowered by certain people who benefit from the working class revolting, right? There's a mass extermination of oppressor classes like civic leaders, like landlords, like clergy. And there's mass starvation from revolutionaries seizing the means of production and either mismanaging them or deliberately withholding food from people who don't share their vision. So you look at these historical attempts to accomplish this Marxist revolution, and tens of millions of people were killed in them. But even so, despite that glowing track record, not all the world has revolted. Capitalism continues to reign supreme. Marx's vision is not fulfilled, and we continue under the unjust system of capitalism. Now why? Why has capitalism hung on? Would anybody care to venture a guess? Because it works, right? That certainly would be one answer to that question, because it works, right? One might argue that it best honors the creational design of God's images, and it best accounts for the realities of sin. One might argue that, but Brendan is going to argue otherwise.
Well, I can, but I guess some would argue that it's because the rich and the powerful benefit the most from capitalism, right? They, at least some people would say.
Yes.
And so then they get to keep the foot on the gas, the foot on the pedal, and the pedal being the rest of us.
Right. So that's what the neo-Marxists would say, right? Go ahead, Randy.
The people who create are the ones who benefit.
Yeah.
That's capitalism.
Yeah.
If you don't create, you help, work, but
right.
You don't get benefit.
Right. So we can make a number of arguments for capitalism. It's not really within the scope of what we're doing tonight, and those would all explain, why capitalism continues to work. Or at least, we can talk about virtuous capitalism versus vicious capitalism and why capitalism, for its success, depends on a kind of Christian worldview. And we're going to set that aside for a minute. And we're going to go with the neo-Marxist Brennan here to explain why capitalism is still going. Yeah. Thank you, comrade. So, an Italian social theorist by the name of Antonio Gramsci, that name's very much associated with cultural Marxism. From his perspective, the oppressed have so imbibed the ideology of the oppressors that they don't even recognize themselves as oppressed, right? They're fish swimming in the sea that can't really fathom what water is, right? And so they think, the oppressed, right, they think that they're part of a fair system that gives them a chance to climb the ladder and join the bourgeoisie, right? The proletariat. You can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you can be somebody. But according to neo-Marxists, that's a lie. The system only holds out the promise of advancement in order to keep holding people down. Now that's Gramsci. Now you have another group of neo-Marxist thinkers by the name of, or not by the name of, but the Frankfurt School. These are a number of thinkers that were located in Frankfurt, Germany before they had to flee the Nazis in the 30s. They all ended up at Columbia University in New York. But I'm not even kidding, that's what happened. And so, they expand these Marxist insights outside the economic realm. And so there are all kinds of cultural values and norms that are impressed upon us, not just from the people in the halls of power, but also the people who run the companies, the people at the head of the economy, the media elites, all these sorts of people. In 1937, one of them, a man by the name of Max Horkheimer, coined the term critical theory in order to describe this reality and to describe an approach to not just understanding it, but disrupting it. Right? So the Frankfurt School, kind of critical-minded, we're going to disrupt this. And they end up at Columbia in New York City, and critical theory starts to work its way out. It starts to metastasize into all sorts of areas of study in the academy. Cultural studies, educational studies, legal studies. And it was predominant in legal studies for a time, mostly an academic thing for a long time. And in critical law theory was concerned about questions of, who wields the power in society. On the traditional view, the ordained authorities, right? Romans 13, the kings that God puts in power, they wield the authority under God, according to divine law or according to natural law. But these enlightened, you might say woke, critical theories adopt a critical view that the law doesn't come from above. The law comes from us. And what the people in charge do is they conscript the divine in order to legitimate and to justify whatever they want to do to keep their power. That's critical law theory. And the problem, quote unquote, with critical law theory getting on into the 20th century is that these theorists essentially viewed this dynamic as colorblind. But then you enter the critical race theorists, like Derek Bell, who was the first tenured law professor at Harvard. And in his view, the ruling class is fundamentally white. And the power they maintain is a racialized power through and through, even when it appears to be aligned with the project of liberation. So you have abolition, you have civil rights, you have all of these things that granted civil rights to all Americans, but they only happened because the way that history was moving, the interests of black liberation happened to converge with the interests of the whites in power. Not because there was any kind of moral revolution or any moral desire for social change or racial justice. And so this is kind of the perspective of critical race theory, beginning to see everything through the lens not just of oppressed versus oppressor, but racially oppressed versus racialized oppressor. And this was mostly confined in the academy, and again, in these niche corners of the academy, until in 1995, a paper was written titled "Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education." And then CRT ideology went wide in the academy, into law, into education, to cultural studies, English, sociology, political science, history. Then eventually, due to cultural events, especially that ramped up around 2020, George Floyd, some of the things that have been happening in culture, it's been popularized by writers such as Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo. Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility, right? So critical race theory very much represents a major stream of the critical tradition and kind of the vehicle by which it entered our cultural mainstream. But we're not just talking about critical race theory tonight. We're talking more broadly about critical theory itself, because critical theory is spread to cover so much more than just race. It's essentially every potentially marginalized identity marker or characteristic. So yes, race, but but also sex or gender, age, ability, disability, ethnicity, intellectual ability. These are all different categories or spectra in which we might find ourselves. And we probably belong to multiple of them at the same time. That gets us into what's known as intersectionality. Intersectionality is the idea that you would belong to multiple marginalized groups. And depending upon how you stack up, you might be more or less marginalized and oppressed than other people who are otherwise in your main group. Like an article was written just a few years ago on The Root titled, "Straight Black Men Are the White People of Black People." We kind of laugh because it seems silly, but from within the logic of intersectionality, right? You might have it tough if you're a black man, but you've got it much worse if you're a gay black man. And if you're a disabled gay black man, you're even farther down the ladder. You see how this works with intersectionality, right? So that's the story, and that's the spread of critical theory. Now, stepping out of history and looking at it less as a development and more as an ideology in itself, we're going to consider the 4 core ideas that really make up the center of critical theory. And the first one has to do with the social binary. This is what we've been talking about with the idea of the oppressed versus the oppressor. Everything rides on this fundamental opposition. In race, you have the whites versus the people of color. In class, you have the rich versus the poor. In sex, you have men versus women. Sexuality, you have heterosexuals versus homosexuals. Gender identity, you have cisgender versus transgender. Religion, you have Christians versus non-Christians. Now, this idea of the social binary that makes up the heart of critical theory, how might we respond to that as Christians? This idea that everything in culture boils down to this power dynamic, this struggle between oppressed and oppressor. How would you respond to that?
Well, one of the things I would say would be that you have to be able to look at history abstractly. There's different factors besides power structures that make capitalism more effective, or certain kinds of education and worldview more effective in making people happier and better off than just simple, race, gender. There's nuances that these people overlook, and they interpret everything in terms of, oh, he's making a lot of money, he's white. In point of fact, people of color make more money than white people in America now. Asians make more money than white people. And the reasons have nothing to do with race. They have to do with other factors. Coming from a father-present home, the stress on education, the stress on hard work. I mean, that's what I'm saying. But to somebody else, it would always be about race or about some. So that would be sort of my answer, that I would talk to people who would say stuff like that.
Brennan?
When it comes to intersectionality, when I hear that, whenever I've heard that, it always comes off as people are, look at me, this is where I rank, I fit within this section of the intersectionality camp, and this is where I find my value, this is where I find my identity. Mm-hmm. And it's honestly a pathetic place to find that. And so my response would be, that identity falls flat on its face, and that it's really not anything biblical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, here, Tony, you go, then I'll go.
I'd ask them a question.
Yeah?
Would you please prove it to me?
Prove what?
What they believe about intersectionality and critical theory. Prove it. Give me bona fide examples. Prove it. Don't shut it out. Mm-hmm. If you can't.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting, right? Prove it. So you might be tempted to get into a war of statistics, right? And they might start to name statistics. They might start to name news stories, right? It's good to know some of those things. it's also good to understand how the system kind of internally falls apart, right? Because sometimes you'll come to an argument and someone will be equipped. Have you considered that, right? What do you say to that, right? And it's interesting. We'll consider another thing called hegemonic power in a moment, where even that right there, prove it to me, is considered as a privileged position, where it's like, whoa, you're using logic and evidence. Those are white oppressor categories that are used to marginalize my lived experience. Again, I'm not, I say these things, please don't misread any tinge of snark in my voice. I'm trying not to do that. But this is the actual argument. These are the arguments that are being made. Neil, I saw your hand.
Yeah, so there is some level that I've talked to a friend. There's some level of agreement.
Yeah.
There are systems, there's historical examples of oppressors, there were colonizers.
Yeah.
And we have to reckon with that reality.
Yeah,
It's just
absolutely.
there. However, it's too reductionist.
Yeah.
It's too ahistorical.
Yeah.
Because there's many examples
Right.
that contradict
Right.
the binary approach.
Right.
So there's got to be, history is usually more messy
Yeah.
than these abstract philosophical frameworks.
Yeah. History is filled with oppression, right? And it's not always necessarily a systemic kind of thing, right? So often it's circumstantial, right? These people are in power, and they might be this color. These people are not in power; they might be another color, right?
Yeah, but when I look at what happened in the Congo
Yeah.
under the Belgians, it's a very, very stark and terrible example
Right.
of oppressor and oppressed.
Right.
Even though it wasn't necessarily racialized
Right.
100%,
Right.
it was a travesty in
Right.
history that
Right.
you just gotta.
Right. So one thing that's important, what Neil is doing right now, is even a broken watch is right 2 times a day, right? Truth is truth, right? And sometimes, even in spite of their own principles and in spite of their own broken worldview, a jacked up system can highlight things that are true. So if oppression exists throughout history, we should have no trouble affirming that. There's lots of oppression in the Bible. It's not the kind of racialized Marxist oppression that, again, Marx talked about, but there is oppression in the Bible. Okay, we can affirm that. But this idea that binaries are inherently invented by human beings in order to further power dynamics just falls on its face based on what we know about creation. Some binaries, some constructs come from God. Right? The critical theory denies the doctrine of creation and denies the existence of God. And so there is no true binary between male and female. There are sexual characteristics, chromosomal characteristics, physiological, all that, right? But what we call male and female is ultimately an imposition that we put on the raw data of nature in order to further our own power agenda. That's the critical theorist's perspective. Whereas we go, no, God created them male and female, right? That's a binary that's written into the fabric of reality. And it's not written into that in order to further anyone's power agenda. It's written into reality for our good, right? So, yes, of course, there are some constructs, there are some binaries that are imposed by human beings, right? Race, for its own reality. It's essentially a social construct. Right? Nobody really thought in race kind of terms the way we do. Like a white person. I'm white, right? I'm Portuguese, right? If you, I'm a different kind of white than you. I'm a different kind of white than you. Hispanics, right? We use the term Hispanics to describe a race. You talk about a Mexican, someone from Spain, someone from Ecuador. Oh my goodness, these are entirely different peoples with entirely different languages and so on and so forth. So sure, race is a construct in some extent, and race was maybe even used as a construct in order to further a power agenda. But that doesn't mean that these created differences are not actually from God. Some binaries, some differences are for our good. They're for human flourishing. Coming back to the male and female one, right? That gives us husband and wife. That gives us mother and father, grandmother, grandfather. These are good things, again, written into creation for our good. So the social binary kind of falls flat in that respect. Now, the second one that we want to talk about. Caesar, what's up?
What happened in Congo?
What happened in Congo? It's a good question. You can ask Mr. Neal about it after our meeting tonight. Yeah. So the next one we want to talk about. So we talked about the social binary. What's up? All right.
Just like kind of like what helps me understand that is like critical race theory, oppressed and oppressor is based on like ontology. Kind of like who you are.
Yeah.
But the Bible view oppressor and oppressor is based on functions.
Yeah.
Like how we act.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's circumstantial.
That's Martin Luther King said.
All right, we got to keep moving. All right. So the next one, the next core idea that we got to talk about when we look at critical theory is hegemonic power. So we might scratch our heads to think that all the members of privileged classes are engaged in oppression, because the vast majority of us who inhabit those classes don't self-consciously walk around oppressing people, right?
For the benefit of some of us who have no idea what hegemonic means, would you please break that down?
Yeah, I'm in the process of doing that.
I figured we would go into the etymology of the actual words.
Yeah, so I'm getting it.
Hedgehog or what now?
Hedgehog.
So, all right, hegemonic power is basically the people in power exercise it in a wholly comprehensive way, right? So, thinking about, according to critical theory, I'm a part of the oppressor class, right? Most of us are a part of the oppressor class. I am a white, middle-class, cisgender, heterosexual Christian man, which means I may as well be the devil. But I don't spend my life oppressing anyone. I have no knowledge of anywhere in my life where I am oppressing someone or where I am holding or exercising any sort of racial animus toward people. Maybe it's there, and I just don't know about it, but I don't see that anywhere in my life. And if I were to ask the vast majority of the people I know who belong to the quote-unquote oppressed classes whether they experience mistreatment from people like me, they'd say no. No, they don't. But according to hegemonic power and critical theory, oppression is systemic. So you can have racism even if you don't have any racists. Because my whiteness is a position of power and privilege that automatically oppresses people of color. That's what hegemonic power is, right? The grip that we, the oppressors, have over culture, over everybody. So all this means is that oppression is ultimately more ideological than it is physical. The oppressors pull all the levers of government and media and education and so on in order to impose our values, impose our norms on society and to maintain power. So white supremacy maintains the power of whites over other races. Patriarchy maintains the power of men over women. Heteronormativity maintains the power of heterosexuals over homosexuals. Christian hegemony, or Christian rule or influence, keeps the Christians in charge, and so on. All of these exist, and they all exert a powerful influence over us, whether or not we actually engage in any sort of direct, conscious oppression. And hence why many people in the critical tradition would say that to be white is to be racist by default, automatically, unless you are deliberately anti-racist. Right? It's like you're living in the Matrix. And once you learn that fact, the only just response is to swallow the red pill and go woke. Now, what do you think about that notion of hegemonic power? Right, this idea that the oppressor class is so in control of everything that we can't even notice it.
I think political correctness is kind of what you're describing, in the sense that the minorities have taken control by forcing those ideas out and making people feel guilty. That, oh, you're wrong, well then you're bad. But if you take away those few people that have that influence, I think the general population It's like 85% of the people, approve of voter ID, but yet, you've got a group of people that are forcing and saying, no, that's going to marginalize, the voters. And does that make any sense? Common sense says, let the people decide, what it's going to be, 85%. But political correctness says, no, you can't do that. You got to let this minority group here control, what's going on.
Right, and that's an important part of this, right? And again, we're going to talk about lived experience in a minute. We're going to talk about something that's known as standpoint epistemology, where you privilege a minority viewpoint, and it's rooted in this idea of hegemonic power. It's kind of like an enlightened circle of academics recognizes that we're all in the grip of this, right? We are racist to the core. And because that's the case, the normal functions of democracy aren't going to get us out of this mess because everybody is washed up in the system. And so what we need to do is set that aside. We need to overrule it in order to recreate a more just society by force or by political hook and crook. So when we think about, hegemonic power, again, like when we think about systemic issues, you want to acknowledge truth wherever it's found, right? Systems are designed by human beings, right? And human beings are sinners. And so we have to be open to the idea that there are aspects of our society that genuinely do advantage some people and disadvantage other people. And if we see that, we ought to be willing to fix that, right? It does us no good. It does not help our witness. It does not help the argument if we just deny. One side wants to say racism is everywhere. Another side wants to say racism is nowhere. The truth, as with most things, is somewhere in between. But here's the important qualifier. These things need to be demonstrated. These things need to be proven from evidence, right? Critical theory assumes that systems are corrupt by definition because of a prior ideological commitment. And so oppression exists because oppression exists. And the evidence for it is assumed before it's proven. And if you present evidence against the narrative, the evidence is either written off or it's explained away. Right? Of course you would see it that way. You're a straight white woman, so on and so forth. Right? So that's hegemonic power, and that's some ideas about how we respond to it. Now the next core idea of critical theory is lived experience. Have you ever seen the hashtag on social media, hashtag believe women, or believe all women? Right?
Years ago.
What's that?
Years ago, more so, when all of that youth Me Too was going on.
Right.
Of course, women aren't going to lie about this. The same thing happened with the children in the nursery school. Children aren't going to lie that they were sexually abused, but they did.
Right. So, that's kind of this move to believe all women in the wake of Me Too. Think about, the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings.
What's Me Too?
You can explain that one later. So, Me Too was a time when women were being mistreated by powerful men, and they started speaking up. Right? We can say other things about that, but that was at the core of it. And so, women spoke up, and some told the truth, some didn't tell the truth. But because women were an oppressed class, this sort of mood arose where you just need to believe women no matter what. So the Kavanaugh hearings, right? A woman from 30 years earlier, when the Supreme Court justice was going to be confirmed, emerged to say that he had abused her. But there was it's 30 years later, purely a memory, no evidence, whatever little bit of evidence they could find pointed in the other direction. But that didn't matter because she had accused him, and we need to believe her. Right? That's the core idea of critical theory known as lived experience. And the fancy term for it is standpoint epistemology. And the idea is that the dominant classes have a single consciousness, just a way of seeing the world that we've inhabited or we've inherited from the culture, right? It just is what it is. Now, that's dominant classes. Dominated classes, the oppressed, have a double consciousness. They see the world through the dominant group's lens, but they also see the world through their own lens, through their own experience, because they can speak to their own particular oppression in a way that no one else can. A woman can speak to sexual oppression in a way that a man never could. Now, here's a quick question that you might ask, or that you might put to someone who holds that kind of view. How can we believe all women when, say, some women embrace feminism and others reject it? Or some women embrace critical race theory, or some black women embrace critical race theory and some other black women reject it, right? Well, if you were to put that question to someone who holds to critical theory, they would respond by reverting back to hegemonic power. All women have been socialized into the cultural values, beliefs, and ideals of the oppressor class. And only some women have woke up and achieved critical consciousness. Those are the women that we should listen to. And the others should be disbelieved until they wake up, if they ever do at all. And so, if you're a member of an oppressor class, you should always and automatically defer to the views and opinions of the oppressed. But only the oppressed who know they're oppressed. So now, what might be an issue here with this? Yeah, Kevin went like this, because round and round we go. Bill.
The way you're defining what a human being is a problem.
Yeah.
And how do you know that all women experience the same thing the same way at the same time?
Excellent question. Yeah.
But
yeah, it seems...
It's a definition. Is a human being, do they just need to be educated or corrected, or are we flawed?
Yeah. Great question. Yeah.
Joanne,
Joanne, did I see your hand? Pamela, did I see your hand?
Yeah. It seems that all critical theory devolves, at some point in time, devolves into people will recognize that, oh, if I jump on this bandwagon, then I can become one of those in power. So it's always just a game of
a power struggle.
And what is significantly lacking in the literature that I've read, at least, on critical theory, is recognizing that we all are sinners.
Yeah.
When it's just completely removed from the equation, so that those who are oppressed are righteous.
Yeah. 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 It's a good observation. We'll talk some about that. Tom.
I was just going to say, it absolutizes, when you say believe women, in point of empirical fact, there are a number of women who have, one of Bill Cosby's accusers, who claimed that he sexually assaulted her at the Playboy Mansion. They found out she was lying. They went back and checked the records. He wasn't there that day. She went with a friend of hers.
Yes. Yeah.
And also, there's a really famous basketball player, same thing happened.
Right.
He got accused, and he actually had tapes around his house.
Yeah.
Surreptitiously running.
Yeah.
So she got brought up on charges. So just as a matter of empirical fact, that's not true.
Right. The false accusation stories are a dime a dozen. Right.
So the concept of believe women.
Right. And that gets at the core problem here. Like, notice how unimportant here is the question of truth. Because in critical theory, truth is not a function of the correspondence between our thoughts and reality. Right. That's a classic view. Right. That's what truth is. If my thoughts line up with what is in the world, it's Thomas Aquinas here, then they're true. Rather, in a critical mindset, truth is a function of the knower's subjective putting together the raw data supplied by reality. Right? It's about my experience. It's about my framework. It doesn't really matter whether a majority figure is oppressing any particular person in an objective sense. What matters is whether the minority person feels oppressed. Right? You start thinking in that way. You wake up, you get woke, you move toward liberation. Al.
So it seemed like the same dichotomy when Christ was before Pilate. And he had the truth. He could have called out angels, but the truth. And Pilate said, "Well, what is truth?" Because Pilate was thinking about the politics, what was going on versus absolute truth. He did not care about absolute truth. And there's this struggle always between the absolute sin and relative sin, right? And it gets with that as well. It feels to me that the absence of truth, the absence of logic, is an outpouring from the different culture. So if I accept this, so we all do, but culture is downstream from religion. Politics is downstream from culture. And I don't know really how to have a proper discussion about truth and logic and a right way to approach it if we don't have a common basis for what truth is. I don't know that it's as I mean, the gospel is the only solution, so don't get me wrong, but without that, I don't know how we come back to that without a power type of struggle. There's been no culture ever where the strong and the smart don't come to the top.
Spoken with all the logocentrism of a powerful white European male. Again, and we'll talk about postmodernism when we get to the end of this. But truth is not real in an objective sense. Truth is a tool to be, just a second, Tom. Truth is a tool to be wielded by those who are in power. Right, that's the perspective here, right? So like you can play your game about truth, but all you're trying to do is trump me and my perspective. So you get that truth out of here and let me speak my truth, right? It's time for my truth to have its day.
But if truth is individual, how do I know your truth is true? So if someone says, oh, my truth is this, well, great, your truth can be that, but I'm bigger and stronger, so I can be your truth, because I got a bigger fist.
Well, I've got more followers on Instagram than you do.
What's that?
I've got more followers on Instagram than you do. Tom.
I was just going to mention, I hope the irony isn't lost on anyone, that all of this that people are using to talk against white European males, the theory comes from white European males.
Sure, yeah.
So it's all that Marx, all of the authors you're talking about, it's all white European males that came up with this. So I just,
It sounds actually much older than that. It sounds like almost the Gnostic heresies,
Yeah, nothing new under the sun.
I got the secret knowledge and you don't, and I know it's true, you don't know the truth, and it just kind of crept on down the ages as well. I'd say even Rousseau, the French Revolution was probably even worse catalyst than Marx with that.
French Revolution's big here. Fourth idea. Tony, quick, then we got to move on.
It's interesting that there's a lot of similarities between woke ideology and cults. A lot of similarities if you look into it.
That's interesting.
Throw that out.
Yeah, okay, we'll run that down later. That's interesting. Fourth idea, social justice. Right? Social justice, another core idea. And it's this idea, what is social justice? Social justice is the dismantling of all unjust systems in society in order to eliminate all forms of oppression. From a Marxist, like a classically Marxist viewpoint, this is economic. From a critical theorist viewpoint, this is everything. This is ideological through and through, in all the categories, law, race, economics, education, so on. So social justice will only come when we deconstruct all of the dominant narratives, all of the dominant norms, values, symbols by which oppressors wield their power. But then comes the question, right? When we topple the narratives, with what do we replace them? The narratives of the critical tradition, the French Revolution, right? It differed from the American Revolution in that the American Revolution in so many ways was trying to get back to first principles, back to biblical principles. The French Revolution was nuts to all that. We're just going to rewrite everything. And so that's
I think a lot of the critical theory and even postmodernism is focused on equality of outcome, and the French Revolution seemed to be kind of focused on that a little bit as well. It would have helped if the ruling class had been kind of a really good and above board, but you had that whole corrupt French. The same is true of Russia with the corrupt monarchy there too. It's kind of like, dang.
But getting back to this idea of throwing off the dominant narratives, because that's what the French Revolution tried to do. And when they came to the power and the Jacobins were in control, heads were rolling, literally. And then what? They didn't have a dominant narrative. They have liberty, equality, fraternity, right? They had, freedom, equality, and brotherhood, right? That was their thing. But, it got so bad that Robespierre basically had to develop a new religion, a religion based on reason, and develop a temple to the goddess reason. Or, they had to have religion smuggled in the back door. And, social justice, right? This idea of the oppressed overthrowing the oppressor and giving us something new, giving us a utopia. The way we've seen it work out in history is that you just cannot avoid it. When the oppressed overthrow the oppressor, they become oppressors themselves, right? Critical theory is very good at deconstruction, right? That's what it means to be critical, but woefully incapable of actually constructing something that is truly and sustainably just, because it lacks a positive vision, right? It lacks a Christian worldview, right? Creation, fall, redemption, consummation. That's the grand story that ties everything together from our perspective and from God's perspective, because it's the real perspective, right? Critical theory categorically rejects that narrative, and they have no replacement. There is no creation. Creation is a category that we use in order to try to take God's divine stamp of approval and put it on whatever we want to do. We just say it's God's will, right? And we write our own law into creation and say it's divine. The fall, sin, according to critical theory, it's not any sort of objective fall of us going astray from some divine norm that we're supposed to uphold. The fall is oppression. To sin is to oppress. And so what is redemption? Redemption is overcoming oppression. Redemption is liberation. Redemption is social justice. The utopia is consummation. Not a new heavens and a new earth, but this earth rid of all of the power dynamics and power struggles. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work because there's nothing. It's ultimately a negative concept. We criticize, we pick, we pull, and eventually there's nothing left. And so as Christians, what we want to be able to do is to come in and offer a truly positive view of what the world is, what's gone wrong in the world, and what has to happen in order for the world to be fixed. Is there oppression in the world? Yes, there is. Why is there oppression in the world? Because there is sin in the world. All we like sheep have gone astray. God created this world as it is. He's put all the norms, all the values, all the stuff into it. And he has challenged us to trust him and to follow him and to live in accord with his revealed will. And when we fail to do that, when we sin in our unbelief, all of our relationships break. And what do you get when relationships break? You get oppression. You get all of the nasty isms in the world, not just racism, all of them. And so what do we need? We need God to write himself into the story, right? We need the creator to become his creation in order to come and rescue us from our sin, to deal with it definitively on the cross. And so what he promises us is a new heavens and a new earth. And in that new heavens and new earth, what we have is a reality that is ultimately and utterly just in every way that the critical theorist wants society to be just. And so part of the challenge for us is we're landing the plane now, and we're going to sing together, we're going to pray, and we're going to have some Chipotle. But part of the challenge for us is to be able to come in and have the conversations with our friends and neighbors who might have a critical perspective, who might have a woke perspective, and we ask them the questions about, all right, what comes next, right? What does society look like in your view? What do you want it to look like? What does it look like when the oppressor is finally overthrown? Okay, and then what? And then what? All right, what's the principle? What keeps you from just becoming an oppressor yourself? What keeps this new form of justice from oppressing everyone who happens to disagree with it? What keeps, another version of the Russian Revolt or the Chinese Revolution or the Khmer Rouge or any of these things from happening again? And then you do the best you can to share the gospel and say, hey, I think we want a lot of the same things. Right? At the end of the day, I think we want a lot of the same things. We're conceptualizing them, and woefully different ways, and we're understanding the nature of the problems differently. There's a lot of disagreement, but at the end of the day, here's the vision of the world we want. Okay, here's how the gospel gets us there, right?
I have to interject here. I mean, I've seen videotapes of Antifa yelling, "We're going to put you in camps. We're going to put you in camps." So I think there's a lot of people who don't want the same thing. And progressive and liberal values are not the same values. So
yes,
a lot of people don't have this. They don't want the same thing. They do want to punish and
right. And if you meet a radical, you can try to peel back the onion on that. Why? Right? Why do you want that? What do you want at the end of the day? Right? We can disagree mightily about the nature of the problem, right, and the best way to go about getting there. And you can say, my worldview, right, my belief in the gospel does not require me to imprison people with which I disagree. It does not require me to become an oppressor, right, because the nature of the problem is different. So yes, in that sense, we have different strategies, and we want different things in the way we execute the vision of justice. But at the end of the day, there's a point of contact there that we can touch on with people to say, you want justice, I want it too. Let me tell you how and why the only place we can ultimately get justice is the cross. Amen. Kevin.
I think a helpful way maybe to go about it is to recognize the power struggle that we've all had ourselves with the Lord, trying to be the oppressor. And so when we do that, a lot of us have lived life and been critical of maybe our parents, or the church we grew up in, or whatever that thing is. We've attempted to do that, not just by society, but also our sinful heart. And our desire, just like Adam, to be God. Satan, to be God. That's what this is. And so us Christians have come to terms with that and said, no, we're not king. God is king. And that's what we can offer. And I think it's can be very helpful if you approach it having gone through some of that struggle yourself and realize that the answer is not my truth. It's the outside truth. You've already said this in some ways. But that is an application that I found helpful.
That's good, Kevin. Thank you. Bill.
I'm very interested in engaging. I think that at the very beginning I have to do what you said at the beginning, was to say that there is a left and a right. There's a political divide. And if I'm going to contend for the gospel, I have to divest myself. I have to say, I'm for the gospel. I'm not to promote this candidate or that policy. Otherwise, I'll end up in a shouting match with the other person because I have political views.
Well, this is good. Thank you all for being here. The discussion doesn't have to stop here. We're going to enjoy a meal together, and you can continue to talk about these things if you desire, or you can talk about the weather if the heat's turned up too much. But yeah, it's important that we come together. It's important that we have these kind of conversations around biblical truth, and we try to understand a little bit more about where people are coming from and why they're coming from that place, because it allows us to better wield the scalpel of the gospel. Like, we understand why they're saying what they're saying. We understand why they're wrong, right, in so many ways, instead of just preaching at them harder. Right? We can understand a little bit more about their assumptions, and we can have a more surgical and tactical approach where we say, hey, it sounds like you're assuming this kind of thing. Explain that to me. Right? Where'd you come up with that? How does that work? Have you considered this? Right? And we're going to work that out. We're going to figure that out together. Kristen.
I think you have to do it one person at a time, and like Kevin said, humbly, for example, and showing love to your neighbor. So, exactly what you said.
Exactly.
What happened to you? I haven't walked in your shoes. Tell me.
If someone comes to you with their lived experience, the first thing you say isn't some kind of takedown of standpoint epistemology. You listen to the person. You get to know the person. You love the person. You take an interest in the person. And if God grants you the opportunity to speak biblical truth into your life, say, okay, let's consider your experience through another lens. Maybe there are more helpful ways for you to think about what's happened to you or what's happening to you. then God opens eyes, God opens hearts.
And sometimes it can be difficult.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have to turn our cheeks a few times.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Good. Well, thank you all.
This has been a presentation from Hickory Grove Presbyterian Church in Mount Juliet, Tennessee. Please feel free to share this content with others. We only ask that you not sell or alter it in any way. If you'd like to know more about the church, visit us on the web at hickorygrovepca.org. hickorygrovepca.org. Thank you so much for listening. May the Lord be your glory, and may His glory be your joy.